Reconstructing Masculinity in America, part of the Office for Equity and Diversity's Critical Conversation series. I'm Ann Phibbs, Director of Education in the Office for Equity and Diversity, and I'm proud to say that the Critical Conversation series is co-sponsored by the University Libraries. Jody Gray, who is in the back there, from the libraries, is responsible for creating a list of further academic resources on each of our Critical Conversation series or topics, which you can link to on our Critical Conversations webpage. This is our second year of offering these conversations, and we're excited to offer live streaming so that you can watch via our website in real time or at a later date, since they will be archived on our Critical Conversations webpage, including the ones that you may have missed. If this is your first one, we welcome you and hope that you continue to come not only for the rest of the year, but for next year as well. Coming up in April, we'll be looking at issues of domestic diversity and international diversity, and I'm excited to say that the Critical Conversation from February that had to get rescheduled due to the weather that focused on American Indian issues has been rescheduled for May 9th, so be sure to check that out. We've also added an opportunity for you to provide feedback on this series and also feedback on topics that you would like to see us cover. If you've signed in over there, we'll email you a link to an online evaluation, or you may access it on, you guessed it, our Critical Conversations webpage, clearly the place to go. As with all of our conversations, we'll start with some discussion among our panelists and our moderator, and then move to a question and answer session with the audience. For today's conversation, we are very fortunate to have as our moderator, Owen Marciano. I apologize, I'm not prepared. Here we go. A little bit more about Owen. Owen has been working in student support roles on college campuses since his days as an undergraduate peer advisor at SUNY Binghamton, and has been actively involved in Twin Cities LGBTQ community organizing for over a decade. Since completing his master's in student personnel administration from NYU, he has worked in LGBT student services there, at Colgate University, and here at the U of M. And I'm proud to say that Owen and I worked side by side, and I learned a lot from Owen when Owen and I worked together, where he began in 2004. Since moving to Minnesota, Owen has had the opportunity to work in community with many smart, inspiring, generous people who have helped him better understand privilege, oppression, and his role and responsibilities in our collective work toward justice. He has extensive experience developing and delivering trainings on racism and white privilege, sexism and misogyny, economic justice, and transgender identities and issues. Owen is currently the prospective transfer student advisor and transfer admissions coordinator in CEHD Student Services. He also serves as co-chair of the University of Minnesota Transgender Commission and is an advisory board member of the Trans Youth Support Network. And I just want to invite folks to find some seats up here, and please welcome Owen Marciano.
Thank you very, very much. I want to say thanks to Anne, as well as to Claire Walter Marchetti and all of OED for hosting this fantastic series of conversations and for inviting me to be a part of it. I am going to be glancing this way to read, so just know that that's going to be happening. I'm just really excited that you all are here today to join us in this conversation. I'm really looking forward to hearing from all of our panelists. And the title of today's Critical Conversation, as Anne mentioned just now, is Breaking the Man Box, Reconstructing Masculinity in America. And every time I looked at that title, I had to really take a deep breath because it's a really huge topic. And the thing that I just kept thinking about was, wow, I'm really, really glad that I'm queer. And I'm really, really happy to be a trans person as I kind of think about this stuff. And I want to talk a little bit about why that is. I say that I'm glad I'm queer and trans in this context because these two identities have sort of forced me to go through a process of questioning things that I had been taught were immutable, natural, and just the way that things are. There were some pretty strict Catholicism-induced gender roles in my household and my communities all through my growing up and my young adulthood, and some pretty severe and violent punishments for coloring outside of gender lines. I was given a very clear set of rules to follow, a list of do's and don'ts, a list of urges to ignore and desires to brush aside, a list of behaviors to expect from people, and a very clear script to play out. I really, really wanted to be a good straight girl. I really did want that. I wanted to play my part well in this role, but I couldn't because ultimately it just was an act for me and it wasn't who I was. And it took a long time to kind of figure that out. When the stress of the straight girl performance weighed too heavily on me, and I started to discover and understand new possibilities in terms of gender and sexuality for myself and for my communities, first, there was a lot of shame to deal with. Because if this box over here, the straight girl box, the one that I was supposed to fit into and do well at, was right and good and normal and natural, and here I am, like floating in space over here, not even close to that box, or maybe even in an entirely different box, then the logical confusion, or the logical conclusion is that I am not right, normal, natural, or good, that there's something wrong with me. And that's a very scary place to be in and to be stuck in, and I was stuck in that place for a very long time. And if I'm not right or normal or natural or good, then I must, good Catholic upbringing, deserve the punishments and the policing that is inflicted on me, however violent that might be. And so for a long time I'm in that place, and the tangling of shame and fear around my queer and trans identities took quite some time to understand. And it took some serious emotional work. It took some academic work, some reading and some writing. For me, that was part of my process. So it took a lot of work to kind of move through the isolation, the fear, and that shame to get to a different place and a different understanding. And thankfully, I survived that journey. And I want to say that not everybody does. And that's a really important thing to remember as we have our conversation today. But thankfully, I did survive that journey. And on the other side of it, I can see clearly that the gender boxes are what was harmful and wrong, and something to kind of think about. And that is why I say I'm so glad that I'm queer and trans, because these identities, really with them, I have been given a gift, which is really a process for challenging that which seems immutable, or that which I'm supposed to believe is immutable and unchangeable. And this process is something that I can continue to practice over and over again and apply to lots of different sorts of identities, forms of oppression, and help me understand the world a little bit better. And I'm really excited to be able to engage with all of you in part of that process today as we look at masculinity and engage with it really critically, particularly in the context of the US and right now. So Anne mentioned when she graciously introduced me, thank you for that, that I get to work with a lot of amazing, brilliant, courageous people. And I am really grateful for that as well, because even though I do have some experience talking about sensitive topics, I have to admit that I get nervous every single time. And when it came time to kind of think about how to frame today's discussion and what kinds of questions to pose, I really needed to crowdsource this. So I just want to thank some of my very close friends who are always willing to step up when I say help. And so I want to thank Anitra Cotledge, Allison Page, Kate Eubank, Lisa Sass-Zaragoza, Steve Dillon, and my Smarty Pants partner, Henry Schneiderman, all of whom are very, very busy people and all of whom took time out to have a conversation with me, email back and forth, as we tried to grapple with how to structure today's conversation. So thanks to all of you. And just to frame it, those questions that I crowdsourced, I then shared with the panelists ahead of time so that they wouldn't be surprised by anything, and also to offer some feedback so that really what we're having right now is the continuation of a conversation that has already begun in community, which I think is really cool, and we'll be able to continue it beyond today as well. So that's very exciting. And I'm very excited to go ahead and get started. So I want to start by introducing our amazing panelists, and I'm going to go in the order that they're on my sheet, so they're not the order you're sitting in. So I'm going to start with Gavin Grivna. Thank you. Gavin is a residence director on campus here at the University of Minnesota in a residence hall of over 700 first-year students, and he interacts with these students as a supervisor, advisor, conduct officer, and educator. Gavin has worked for the Department of Housing and Residential Life for the last 5 years and completed his MA degree in 2012 from the College of Education and Human Development. Ah, good job. Studying educational policy and administration with a focus on higher education. Can you tell I read these ahead of time? As a partner with the Aurora Center on campus, Gavin works with the Step Up program on bystander prevention efforts and programming with students. Gavin also currently serves as the chair of the University Men's Network, a group that seeks to engage faculty and staff in conversations relating to masculinity as it relates to gender equality. Thank you for being here. I'd also like to introduce Zanzili Isoke, who is right here to my left. Zanzili studies Black women's politics and activism in urban spaces. She teaches courses in feminist theory and methods, women and race in the U.S., gender and popular culture, and Black feminist geographies. She is author of Urban Black Women and the Politics of Resistance, using intersectionality as a central analytic tool and the stories that contemporary Black women activists tell us about politics as her primary evidence. Her book examines both the practical and discursive roles that Black women activists play in hip-hop politics, Black queer politics, and other contemporary social movements in the U.S. Her work has appeared in Transforming Anthropology, Gender, Place, and Culture, a journal of feminist geography and souls, a Journal of Feminist Geography, separate thing, and Souls, Journal of Black Politics, Culture, and Society. Thank you for being here. Jason Jackson serves as the Assistant Director of the GLBTA Programs Office at the University of Minnesota. Jason received his bachelor's degree from the U of M and is currently a graduate student in higher education, also in CEHD. Jason co-founded Tongues Untied, an amazing program for LGBT people of color at the U of M, and was formerly active in the Twin Cities ball scene and Twin Cities Black Pride. Thank you for being here, Jason. And last but not least, Kyle Guante Tran Myrie is a hip-hop artist, two-time National Poetry Slam champion, activist, and educator. He and/or his work have appeared on Upworthy, MSNBC, Racialicious, Feministing, NPR, The Progressive, and City Pages Artists of the Year list. Aside from performing, much of his work today revolves around working with youth, exploring social justice concepts through the lens of artistic expression and storytelling. So a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you all for being here. And I have about 4 or 5 questions that we're going to kind of ask and spend a little time with, and then I will open it up to questions that you might have. So as you're sort of listening, if you have questions that come to mind, jot them down, remember them, and we'll get to those at the end. To get started, I wanted to ask each of the panelists if there's anything more that you would like to say about yourselves and your work. This would be a good time to do that. And also, I talked a little bit in my intro about why this is so personally important to me, and I wonder if you have some comments about why this topic draws you, why you agreed to be here today, and what's important about it to you. Whoever would like to start.
Failing my test. Yes, I am. Hey. Hello. Hi. How you doing? So thank you so much again. My name is Jason Jackson, as Owen said. And for me, this conversation is really interesting and important for me. But I'm questioning too, like, why am I sitting on this panel? Because I do identify as a gay man, but definitely not a masculine man, very much so femme, and very much so proud of that. But I think that over the course of my life, I've always tried to figure out for me what was the best way that I could connect more with Black men who may identify as straight or same-gender loving, who may not be out or may exude masculinity. Because I think that one of the barriers that I've always had a hard time with was really connecting with Black men. And I'm noticing that same pattern when I speak a lot with Black male or male-identified gay students on campus. And so I've always been trying to kind of figure that out as I kind of move through my process, especially as I'm starting to really understand the importance of needing allyships within communities of color, particularly in Black community as well. So that's why this conversation interests me. And it also, too, really does speak a lot to my own development and being told how to be masculine, right? And then me having to reject that and then having to deal with the reactions of family and friends and schools and community, and then coming to terms with that as an adult person. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll go. So first, I think one of the reasons why, sometimes I'm like, why did I agree to that? Because that's a hard topic for me to talk about, because I study Black women's political engagement, but in cities, and particularly in Newark, New Jersey. But when we study, particularly this particular city of Newark, you're also studying the politics of generations of Black men who have been in leadership in the city. So in many ways, my retelling of Black women's politics is also in response to the types of challenges and issues that Black men in political in leadership positions in the city have had to respond to. And so it's interesting to have that conversation in feminist studies, particularly Black feminist studies. There is a way in which we challenge notions of heteropatriarchy, at least in my work, and also white supremacy. But even within the context of that discussion, Black men often appear, and they appear in particular kinds of ways in these discussions. And so I think it's important, to think critically about Black masculinity, as a Black female, I think it's just important to think about that as a kind of critical Black feminist kind of topic, because it's something that we are maybe not directly, but I think indirectly writing about and in some ways in critique of. So that was one of the reasons why I think I wanted to be part of this conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like I said, I come to this conversation while holding a number of relatively privileged identities, because I read as white, I read as a kind of stereotypically masculine, straight guy who's loud and blah, 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 is on stage, center of attention. And I think for anyone who does social justice work or social justice education work, when you're coming from any type of place of privilege, for me, it's been a process, right? Like at first it might just be altruism. It's like, I want to talk about gender stuff with the students I work with because it's important, right? On that level. And then maybe you gradually move along and be like, well, I think this is important because, there are women in my life who are affected by patriarchy and by toxic notions of masculinity, et cetera. And then eventually, again, I can't speak for anyone else, but for me, the more I do this work, the more I see how it affects me and my own life and my own buy-in to talking about this stuff. I think having a critical understanding of gender, and we're going to talk later about ways that again, toxic masculinity hurts men too. But I think having a critical understanding of gender is a really vital lens to having a critical understanding about the world and the way things actually work. So that's what keeps drawing me back to this, I think.
I am interested in this conversation because of my own privilege, and I think it wasn't until about 3 years ago that I had really started to explore and understand what does it mean for me to identify as a man. And due to that privilege, I think I had the luxury of not being challenged a lot on that front. And when I would do exercises of identifying my identity and writing down what was important to me, I would never write down being a man on that list almost every time. And I never really thought about that until I was kind of challenged by some of these concepts and things that occur. And I just thought it was incredibly important that is a topic of importance to me that I should explore, but I hadn't really thought about at all up until about 3 years ago, which I thought was a travesty. And so I want to engage these conversations to shine a spotlight on some of those areas where maybe it isn't always a focus of attention, and not to, in an effort to reclaim power or anything like that, but more to draw attention to the fact of the negative effects it may have on men, boys, girls, and women, and all genders moving forward. And so I think that's why I am intrigued by this topic.
Great. Thank you all so much. So I'd like to ask, in the description for today's event on the flyers and all of that, one of the statements is, historically, certain images of masculinity have been foundational to American beliefs and values. And I guess I'd like to hear from you all, which images of masculinity would you say have been foundational, and how and why? Do we need to assign
I
a
can't
order?
stand silence. So I'm just going to open my mouth. So this one's a hard one for me, right? Because when I think about what has been foundational for me, I'm always thinking about the positive. And I think that without actually knowing I was doing this, I was seeking out folks who maybe expressed or were masculine in the way that I wanted to be masculine. Because I was told I had to be masculine by my family and even my friends. And sometimes it was said covertly or overtly, right? So for me, I remember when I was growing up, my sister was in college, and I remember she had like the posters of like Malcolm X and all these other folks in the Black Panthers and stuff like that, and they had the guns and they were very sharp and suited up, and that was seemingly so the notions of men. It was always talked about very positively about this is who black men are, and my sister, decided to give me a college course at the age of like 10. I wasn't ready for it, but she made it feel like this is what it meant to be a black man, a strong black man, right? And personally, I'm not really one for guns or leather. But I remember though really liking some of the images though of power, right? Of black male power. I knew I wanted to feel that. I didn't want to necessarily exude or express that. And over time, like there were television shows that also kind of open up ideas or notions. And again, I'm going to be speaking mostly about black masculinity because that's where I come from, that's what I see, and that's what I'm personally more interested in. I live in a very white world, and so for me to when I speak about blackness, it's pretty much about owning my own identities and supporting people who deal with double marginalizations, be black, gay, femme, etc. Right? So there was the TV show, The Cosby Show. I'm sure most of you remember that show if you're over the age of 20, 25, I don't know. But there was The Cosby Show, and there was Bill Cosby. And I have my issues with that show, like some people do, but it was nice to see him because he was all snuggly and he had like little Jello commercials. And also I saw a man who was open enough and seemingly so shared power with his wife, because on the show he actually was a doctor and his wife, I believe, was an attorney, and they both seemed to have all this time to spend with their children. But he, I don't know how, but whatever, I liked it. And he was good, and he was fun. He wore the fun sweaters, and when he was tough, but when he was nice, he was nice. And I was really kind of inspired by that. But I remember in my family circles, and I would like to listen to people, and they would say things, and they would always make comments about Bill Cosby being a punk, right? So again, to be black, to be a man, and to be masculine, you have to be tough, right? And another quick thing that was foundational for me was seeing my uncle, who was married, got a divorce, they had children, and when my uncle's wife left the house, he ended up playing multiple roles, right? Working a lot, coming home, playing with the kids, cooking for them, etc. And in my family, I remember hearing critiques about him, like saying that basically he should just leave. He should be out hanging out, going on dates with women and doing etc. Right? And blaming the woman for leaving, and it was her role and her job to stay home with those kids. If you're a mother, you should do that, right? And so I remember hating that. And I spent the summer with him, and I talked a lot about what it meant to be a man from his point of view. And never forget, and he told me that for him to be a man or to exude masculinity, it was about taking care of your family. It's not about going out and sleeping with 90,000 people or being too tough to talk about how you feel. And so he's been in a lot of ways my role model. He doesn't identify as gay, but he definitely does, for me, he doesn't reconstruct the man box. I think that he actually expands the man box, which to me I'm kind of much more fascinated in personally.
Yeah, I guess my answer to this question is, both in culture and in my actual life, like role models or images of masculinity have always been, athletes and soldiers and like rebels, right? And it's interesting to me how even resistance to traditional conceptions of masculinity are often rooted in traditional conceptions of masculinity. Like, I think of, you don't play by the rules, or you value your individual freedom, you don't want to be put into a box. Like, these are all positive lessons, but they're all deeply embedded in these images that I came up, growing up with. And I think it'll be an interesting thing to later in this conversation maybe to talk about that line between, like, can traditional modes or whatever of masculinity be used to critique, or is that also problematic in and of itself?
The two things that come to mind with this, for me, one would be superheroes, and the idea of when I was young, just really looking up and aspiring to be a superhero in every sense of the word. They were always, whether it was Batman, who was very smart and could do everything, or Superman that literally could not be harmed. That idea really kind of stuck with me, and I think reaffirmed a lot of the messages that I was communicated by my peers or by others, that you are invincible and everything will be great and you make the best decisions, which I have learned since that that's not necessarily true. And the other thing that comes to mind, opposite the superhero thing, is my family. Jason, you had mentioned kind of influence there. For me, the thoughts of my dad, and when I viewed him when I was younger, it was very much, he's a technical person. He was able to repair every electronic device you could ever imagine, or was very hands-on. And my uncle, who was a very outdoors type person, fishing, hunting, and also the images that I would see also is him building the fires at our family gatherings. So very much just these raw images in my mind. And now what I see when I look to them is more, in particular for my father, the sense of humor, the lightheartedness that he brings to the table, as well as just the passion that he shows for hobbies. Whether or not they're mainstream or not, or they're viewed as a positive, as a male identified individual, like it doesn't really matter. His passion is amateur radio and being on there, and that's not something that everyone would think of or would assume, but he loves it and he's all in, and I value that very much so. And then for my uncle, the other idea of the investment that he puts into individuals and the caring that he shows, that he's just a very emotional person, and I value that, how family is important to him in every sense of the word. And I'm still trying to think of superheroes nowadays and how I can see the two differently, but that's still a raw thought as all the Marvel movies come out, and I get excited, but then I also think about what are those impacts right now, and I don't have an answer, unfortunately, for you on how that might be the positives that I might take from those experiences now. But certainly with family, I think that's the important piece that I saw.
So I'm going to take first I'm going to look back, way back. One of my first experiences with tenderness was from my grandfather, who would take me by the hand and walk me over to the corner store to get ice cream. And whenever I was over their house, I would always have this experience. And sometimes he would get bacon, and we would actually kind of cook out actually a whole kind of pan full of bacon and eat it. That's how spoiled and how tender he was to me. And I loved it. And I love this man. And, so that's one of the earlier memories of masculinity and maleness that I can remember. A second one was during my middle school years, and here I'm thinking about actually Magic Johnson, and particularly his finesse and creativity, because I used to love the Los Angeles Lakers, and I was always kind of looking at the dream team, if you guys are familiar with, Magic, Byron, Kareem, and a few others, and those were kind of when I'm actually thinking about black men and black maleness. And then finally, I think would be foundational for me politically would also be Malcolm X, because he talked about something called self-determination. And that was really important for me as a college student, and, developing a sense of kind of consciousness about my surroundings, and a consciousness about racism, and actually being able to make sense of everyday forms of racism that I experienced growing up in public schools in California. But if I go back actually to 3rd and 4th grade, the most prominent kind of notion of masculinity that I would see every day on TV was actually Ronald Reagan. And I remember the Iran-Contra hearings, and at that time I didn't know what they were talking about. I just remember this line, I do not recall And so happened to look back, if thinking about foundational things about why certain things made sense, like why someone like Malcolm X made sense to me, was because it enabled me to interpret another masculine character like a Ronald Reagan. And so I would have to think that, looking back and trying to figure out, how, social and political culture has shifted throughout my life, and which types of prominent masculine figures have kind of influenced my thinking about the world. I would have to say those are some of the kinds of the kind of icons of masculinity that I can talk about. But then I will also reference this other occasion that I started thinking about 5 or 6 years ago, when a person very dear to me had the misfortune of getting beaten up in St. Louis, and he's a black male, my big brother, but he got beat up by a white boy. And that was completely unacceptable to my uncles, meaning, you are a sissy. You cannot let that white boy da-da-da-da-da. And I remember this whole scene, and it was a horrific scene, because my brother, and I actually had an opportunity to see this. My brother was, held down by my cousins/uncles, because they were cousins, but they were old enough to be uncles. We read them as uncles, and we respected them as uncles, but being held down and beaten because he had made the mistake of failing a particular masculinity test that he was given, that he probably didn't even know he was taking when he walked home from school that day. And these are some of the kinds of, when I think back about masculinity in my lifetime, some of the things that kind of come up. And so there's a kind of mixture of tenderness, patience, and attentiveness, and finesse and creativity. That was magic in my grandfather. But then you also have that's also juxtaposed against these images of violence and deceit by Ronald Reagan, and then also being able to read back and being able to have this critical lens to read back against certain things that I think came from Malcolm. So that would be how I would kind of think about masculinity and foundational forms of masculinity for myself at this particular point in time.
Thank you all very much. Thank you for sharing that. Guante, you alluded to this in your response a little bit. We know, obviously, there's a very high cost of these traditional notions of masculinity and the man box for women and feminine people. And I would also like to take some time to explore what are the costs of this for male-identified people, men and boys, and also related, what might be some of the costs of raising feminist kids, especially maybe feminist boys, and kind of what does that mean to you, and what might be some of the costs around that?
Yeah, most of my work is with youth. I work with college students, but also high school students, and lately a lot of middle school students. And I mean, some people here might remember, but middle school is brutal, and it's not just around gender stuff, but anything pushing back against any tradition is very, I guess, hurtful to a lot of these kids. I can say the word kids. And I think if we focus specifically on masculinity stuff, I think, it's almost a very, very different kind of microaggression. People talk about microaggressions with people who hold oppressed identities, or it's the quote-unquote little things every day that just stack up and contribute to stress, which we know contributes to like unhealthiness, like in your actual body. And I think with gender stuff and masculinity, a lot of it is the constant, I guess, being on your guard, or always feeling like you have to do a certain thing, or if that you don't do that certain thing, there's something wrong with you. And yeah, I mean, I could go on with that. A lot of my work is around that kind of thing, but that's what I see happening a lot with young people. And then when we start to talk about it and break it down and have more of a critical understanding of it, it's incredible to see how on point they are. Like, they know these things are happening and they understand them. It just takes having that conversation.
Hello? Okay, so in terms of masculinity that I've seen and I've noticed, I think that one of the biggest, well, a couple of biggest problems, one of them, though, is definitely around men being able to speak up and ask for help. Asking for help with your homework, asking for help when you're feeling hurt, asking for help when you're tired or you may be feeling depressed or something else is kind of going on with you, is actually reaching out in ways that we kind of negatively effeminize certain characteristics that some men won't even do because it kind of goes outside of masculinity. And I see it hurting them. And even I myself have fallen prey to those. I never forget when I was like 12 or 13 maybe. I'm not going to say who it was, but I had to have that man-to-man talk, you know, and being told about what I should do. How do I carry myself? How do I speak? How do I not ask for help? How do I not cry in certain situations? How do I not do all these things that I may, as a human being, need to do, like freak out and cry sometimes, freak out and ask for help when I needed it. And even as an adult, those kinds of things still kind of creep up in my work, and they creep up in my personal life, and they creep up in my relationships. I have a hard time at times asking for help because the notions of masculinity, even though I tried to not buy them, I have bought them, and there's times when I won't even ask for help from my own parents when I needed it, or from my friends, or my boyfriend, right? Because I'm thinking there's something wrong with me, right? There's something effeminate. And have I bought into sexism because of masculinity, notions of masculinity, which is really scary. Another thing, too, that I think hinders, that is a cost, too, that really concerns me a lot, too, is when I think about male and male-identified people who may identify as gay and bisexual, too. I'm starting to notice, it's not starting, I'm sure it's always been there, but I do think that we buy into patriarchy as like gay men and bisexual men. We buy into notions of masculinity as better or more powerful. And I was having a conversation with a coworker earlier today about like online dating and how if you go on some of these online dating sites, you'll actually see the words very, very clearly, and like no blacks, no femmes, no Asians. I can go on, right? And people will be very open and to write out on public on the internet that I don't want any. I want someone who's masculine and or straight acting. Right, as if I don't even know what straight acting means, but we'll get to that later. But I see that creeping up, though. I see it creeping up in a lot of ways in which even gay men who have sex with or in relationship with other gay men and men-identified people, like patriarchy and even notions of masculinity creep into our bedrooms, into our personal lives. And it's very difficult. Does that make any sense? Right? And so I think that hurts us a lot, right? And so I'm always asking, particularly young students who come to me and say, well, you know, I like this guy a lot, but he's kind of femme, and I'm not really sure if I'm interested in him because he's kind of like a girly girl, right? And I'm always questioning, having them think about who's in your bedroom with you? Who's in relationships with you when you're talking about someone and someone's gender performance or someone's notions of masculinity and femininity? Is it like the straight mainstream world? Is it men who may have told you that being masculine or being effeminate is weak? Like, what are those things? I'm always having people think critically about those because it hurts us. And it can also, too, stop us from learning how to actually love each other, right? In more ways than one.
For me, this question kind of raised the idea of hypermasculinity and the pursuit that many, and I feel like I bought into that of you have to find the most masculine thing to do and kind of undercut the others to be able to get to the highest rank. And there is no ranking, but that's kind of what works in my mind, and how you can get to that highest stratosphere of masculinity. And for me and for others that I've kind of spoken to on this topic, I think that's where a lot of the ideas of this cost come from, of feeling, these ideas of discomfort or not being able to be your true self, that you're kind of trying to put on a show. You're trying to put on your best face and say what people are expecting to hear versus what you're actually wanting to say or do or be passionate about, whatever. And one of the things that I would connect this to, there's an article in Time magazine about a boy crisis, and is that a thing? And they were talking about how this study at Columbia and Ohio State was showing that boys who put in more effort towards studying suffered socially. That it's just kind of this natural gifted thing given that, are you going to take time out to study? No, you can just go party, be fun and, everything just comes very naturally to you. But if you go against that, it has some impact there socially. The other people are going to look down upon you, and you'll fall down in the ranks of the masculine hierarchy. And the other is that they're showing that young girls were getting more of the academic honors throughout that process, and they were doing better academically. And I think that has a lot to do with also those elements of not being your true self, not being able to be comfortable showing your true interests and passions. And for me, I think the perfect example of when I was younger is I felt the need to be in sports because I needed to be in sports. So baseball, basketball on a regular rotation. And then in around 9th grade, I made the switch to swimming and everything band related. And which was my true passion. It's what I really loved to do. And I had the ability to be comfortable being in those activities and saying that's okay. And I acknowledge that. But being able to, it would play out in the conversations I'd have with others on how I'd talk about that, whether I would kind of undercut to begin with, saying, I know this is I went the really nerdy route starting 9th grade, or, oh, yep, just trying to acknowledge and save face of, you might put me down a peg, but I want to make sure that I put that out there, and I want to be able to tell you what I am. And so I was trying to save face, saying, here's who I really am, but just in case you're not okay with that, I'm going to give a little precursor in the beginning. That way it's okay. It's okay, right? Kind of a thing. So that's what kind of came up for me when thinking about what the cost is, anyways.
I was actually, real quick, I would add, I played, I think, 8 years of football, and I didn't even like football. It was never a question. Literally never crossed my mind to be like, oh, I could just do something else after school for 3 hours every day. And I think that the unquestioning aspect of it is also very, I keep coming back to this word, but toxic.
I would say in the type of society we live in terms of the intense types of violence that's kind of directed toward black, male, masculine, red bodies, certain types of forms of masculinity can actually be deadly. The performance of certain types of masculinity, particularly for black men and others who might be able to pass as black men. And so I think sometimes the costs are extremely high. The story that I related about my brother, it never really linked. He had some experiences with some of the stereotypical things that we associate with black, poor, urban poor men, experiences with incarceration, with trafficking of illegal substances, with gangs and that sort of thing. But that literally passing those types of tests literally cost him his childhood and I think also his adolescence. And, luckily he was able to overcome some of the natural traps. But I think for some folks, it can lead to the loss of life in terms of certain types of modes of masculinity that are kind of trafficked in media discourses. And I think that when we talk about, and I always will have to talk about black masculinity because that's what I know and I'm most familiar with. But I do think that it comes at the expense of certain lives and well-beings in terms of how very kind of patriarchal ways of being a man kind of hurt relationships and as a result hurt communities. I think that's something that we have to keep in mind when we talk about this, let alone individuals. And I also think that, the types of, the forms of masculinity that are promoted on, in our commercials, I think the Axe commercials and the Cadillac commercials, this kind of obsession with greed and sex and, this kind of, physicality. The results of that, in my thinking and my way of thinking, is the promotion of violence and war and aggression as a way of being in the world, and I think that we can see that in some of the United States foreign policy choices, particularly in the 2000s. And so when I think about the cost of masculinity, I think that society itself plays it takes a huge toll on society, and I think on particular communities. I think one form of masculinity, we think about this whole thug image. This whole trope of the thug has a lot to do with mass incarceration. And if we're thinking about mass incarceration in this kind of way of, and and the thing about mass incarceration, it's not just one generation. It's like 2.5 generations have had to contend with mass incarceration in Black and brown communities, meaning African American and Latino communities. How are the types of masculinities that comes out of experiences of containment and extreme forms of violence, how does that impact communities? And then as a corollary, how does it impact kind of society as a large? So I think that the cost of masculinity, particularly certain forms of masculinity, can, it can, make one either more or less predisposed to certain types of violence and thereby, I think, premature death. So those are some of the things that I think about when I think about the cost of masculinity. And then that's on a personal note. I was praying. I'm like, I don't know. When I first realized I was like having feminist types of ways and my personality could be read in that way, I'm like, you know what? I don't want to have boys. So I was praying for girls. So because how do you deal with that? If you love them too much, that's a problem. If it's an issue. We haven't been taught how to love Black men and how to care for Black men. I don't think in terms of just real lessons and so I luckily had 2 girls, but now I'm in a new relationship, and so I will likely be a new mom. And so, there's a possibility, and, that I will be raising a male child who, we'll see how it works out. But I'm glad I've had these extra, 15 years of experience and study and, under my belt before I have to deal with these types of kind of dilemmas. Because at 23, when I first had my oldest daughter, I didn't have a clue. And I think that was a wise choice. At that age and not having to deal with that type of thing. But I think it's tragic, actually. It's a tragic story, really, because we're not taught how to, I don't think, love, respect, nurture Black males, period. I don't see that, but maybe to be sex objects toward, but not to, love and engage and be attentive to and care for Black males, I think, even at a very young age.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, because that is a detriment. Like, that's a huge cost, and that's one of those costs too about masculinity that I even forget that I see on a almost daily basis with students on campus that I'm concerned about. And even like in my own family, just recently I had my 17-year-old nephew stay with me for like a week or so. And I live in Uptown, which is mostly white-ish neighborhood. And I never forget, he wanted to go out and do stuff and walk around and build stuff in the snow, whatever he wanted to do. And so as he was ready to leave, the first thing I do is I go into mama mode, because I play mama sometimes to babies. But I ended up like pulling off his hood from his parka. And I unzipped and I was checking this, and I ended up trying to like pull his pants up a little bit. And I was doing it just naturally, but if I stop and think about why I was doing that, I wanted him to come back home. I wanted him to not be stopped in the street. I wanted him to not be seen as a thug or a person who's going to rob someone, or why are you wandering around in this like uptown neighborhood, right? Because I was thinking about his life. Or I was thinking about who could pick him up and put him in a cop car, and now he'd be marked for the rest of his life, because in a lot of ways he is seen, read as a male-bodied person who is expressing masculinity with a hood, with sagging pants, right? And even though I do want kids to pull their pants up, I do get really scared. I get so concerned about their well-being while they're performing masculinity, right? And so then how do I talk about masculinity positively with young Black men and let them know that it's okay to be, right? So thank you for saying that. It got me thinking.
I also want to add on the topic of the violence and aggression piece. I think just a thought that had spurred a thought for me too of how that plays out most often when in feelings of that moment when you feel emasculated, or even the perception that you feel emasculated. And again, in that pursuit, trying to claim it back, one of the ways is to be violent. That's what we've kind of taught. And that would be a great performance, and therefore, yep, I've reasserted myself, and that's great. And I think that's one of the dangers, too, is that at a certain point, and all too quickly, I think, violence and aggression really come out in these ideas of masculinity in the worst sense of the word. And this is the thing we really need to, first and foremost, intervene as far as I'm concerned, and try to limit as much as possible, because that has a lot of harm for not only ourselves as men and boys, but certainly also as very well known to women and other genders as well.
Again, real quick, this will relate to the next question too, but I think it's worth naming that when we talk about hypermasculinity in terms of black and brown men, you know, we talk about the dangers and the potential death. When we talk about hypermasculinity with white men, like, that can be rewarded. As much as there are costs, there are also rewards. And I think that problematizes what we're going to talk about next, which is, you know, how do we deconstruct this and reconstruct this?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that transitional phrase. Yeah, and for all of your comments. So part of what I was talking about with my community of folks that I named earlier, as we were thinking about how to structure today's conversation, what I was called out about was that I was assuming that reconstructing masculinity was the same thing as deconstructing patriarchy, and that is not necessarily true. And so this next question is about that distinction. If reconstructing masculinity and deconstructing patriarchy are not necessarily the same thing, what does or could a masculinity that opposes patriarchy look like? So just that. They've had time to think ahead of time. I didn't spell this out there.
Well, okay, I'm just going to go gee whiz, Professor.
Go for it.
I'm sorry. And this is probably going to be a hard earful for the audience, so I apologize ahead of time. But if you're not deconstructing racism and white supremacy in this society, you are not deconstructing patriarchy. Because the way in which, and I also say capitalism too, if you're not the way in which our dominant ways of being in this society, accumulating wealth, patriarchy is kind of, it's influenced by practices of domination, genocide, colonialism, slavery, etc. So until I think our society can begin to figure out a way to live that is not predicated upon exploitation and violence, just generally speaking, we are not going to undo patriarchy. And if we are not really accountable to the, people who have lost their lives over generations as a result of enslavement, as a result of, colonization, as a result of genocide against Native Americans, then we are not undoing patriarchy. So if we're not talking about reparations for the harm being done over generations, we're not talking about ending patriarchy. So that's how I would go and deal with that. And so I would say, how do we undo these how can we undo the violences that have been perpetuated, or begin to redress the violences that have been perpetuated by, white male supremacy? When we get to that point where we're ready to redress that violence and redress that hurt, that injury, then I think we can talk about patriarchy. But if we're not talking about, we're having conversations about whether or not we should have affirmative action, then I just don't think we're doing anything with patriarchy if you're not undoing white supremacy. So that's my thinking on the topic. So, and that's not it's kind of more up in my field of thinking, but that's just my way of understanding it. So I don't see patriarchy as being a distinctive system from white supremacy and also capitalism in the Western world that we live in now. So,
Thank you.
Yeah. I guess, almost going it from the other level, like, as someone who's very kind of direct service, like working with little kids sometimes, because I wouldn't disagree with any of that. But just what comes to mind for me for this question is, one, I think sometimes a knee-jerk reaction was like, well, we don't want to say, quote unquote, real men are always strong and buy trucks and eat steaks. So let's say, well, real men respect women and real men blah blah blah. And I think that can also be harmful. As much, and then again, that's problematized too by other intersections of identity. But I think in a general sense, it's about letting people be who they are, however they define that, however they want to construct their own identity. So that's one thought. And the other thought is, I'm really interested in taking these types of conversations out of academic spaces and outer feminist spaces, and having them in places where even if people aren't 100% like, deconstructing patriarchy 100% of the time, they're planting these seeds. So like when football coaches talk about street harassment to their team, or when movie stars and like action movie stars talk about bullying, or when rappers talk about rape culture like Lil B just did last week, I think those types of spaces, again, that's not going to deconstruct patriarchy on its own, but I think it's about this larger force of pushing the conversation in the direction we want to go.
You guys can do it.
Yeah, I think I won't go long because I echo a lot of what has been said, but the thing that I would probably try to also add my thoughts on are that idea of feeling like your true self, and celebrating whoever anyone is for whatever, just innately, and not trying to think about I need to be this way or that way, or even looking at someone else's identity that might differ from identifying as a man in this idea of masculinity and seeing it as lesser, or seeing that as something that might be an opportunity to again reaffirm your masculinity. And I think that a lot of that, for me, the approach that I tend to take is really trying to bring in that celebration of who I am, being confident in myself, and not discrediting whatever passions I may have or interests, and then also bringing in a lot of love for anyone else who that is. And I try to bring that into my interactions with students on a regular basis. So it's not just me reaffirming my role, and here I am, the authority figure who's meeting with you, making decisions, or assisting you in the process of being a college student. But how can I support your goals and who you are, and move forward with supporting you and what you would like to get out of this institution versus what my priority necessarily is for you as a student. One of the things that it made me also think of is, again, not perfect in the sense of pursuing that ultimate end goal, but there's a documentary called Five Friends out there, which I really enjoyed watching. It talks about these 5 male friendships that a man named Hank has, and the connections that are, I would, atypical and would be shot down quite a bit outside of that space. But those 5 friendships really highlight some of the better things of what masculinity could be, in my opinion. And I look and watch that. And again, it's not a perfect idea, but it's a start in my mind. And I looked at that as kind of a more aspirational type goal for myself.
Yeah, sorry, my head was like spinning all this loveliness on this panel. I got lost in my own thoughts. But when I think about the term patriarchy, I guess similarly to what Zinzile was saying, but when I've always thought about it, and even regardless of the billions of definitions that I learned about patriarchy through academia, I've always seen patriarchy as white, male, upper class, straight, cisgender, all kinds of privileged identities you can imagine, right? And so I always question, whose work is it to really begin the work of deconstructing or eliminating patriarchy altogether? I do think that one of the things that we teach this, and we talk a lot about this in our GLBT, gay, lesbian, bi, and trans workshops, are what are the privileges that people do have, and how can you use those privileges to actually make change? And similarly to what Guante was talking about, how can you use your power as an athletic coach or a teacher or somebody who has a power position to really look around and see who's not in the room, who needs to be in the room, and making those things happen. But I think before those things happen, we have to constantly be in conversation and talk about what these things mean. And I think when we become silent, we'll never get to a place where we'll ever, I even question whether or not we'll eliminate patriarchy, but that's my own pessimist ways. But I think that we need to keep having those conversations.
I think it's possible.
I think so.
I hope so.
I don't know.
I think maybe it's been said inherently, but I think it's also worth naming, it isn't just about having these conversations. It's about, if we want to deconstruct patriarchy, it means organizing. It means taking part in organizations who are doing activist work around the issues that prop up white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. And I mean, that's happening in many different ways, in many different communities, in many different spaces. And so, you know, I always try to encourage the students I work with, one, you know, to like think critically, let's have these conversations, but like, let's get involved too, and let's organize things.
Right. And going back to one thing I just said too was I think I actually said that I'm not sure if it's possible that we can eliminate patriarchy. Deconstruct, more than likely, yeah. Right. And I think that in that way, and living in 2014, I kind of come from that viewpoint because I sit around and have conversations about people who constantly tell me the same things about post-racial crap, right? And we have a black president. That we've got equal rights for LGBT people because of marriage amendment, right? And I guess in a lot of ways, I think that the idea of eliminating like years and years and years of a dominating force, and how do you actually eliminate that? I wonder if I'll ever see that in my lifetime. And that's what concerns me. That make sense, sort of? Okay. Negative.
So I just have one more preset question, and then we'll open it up. So get ready. Yeah, let's get your questions ready. So the last one I wanted to ask was, in your particular field, however you might define that, academia, art, student services, support services, whatever it might be, where do you see the most generative or transformative work regarding masculinity? Who or what out there right now is inspiring to you around this, and to think about masculinity differently? Who challenges you? Whose work should we be reading or paying attention to right now?
I'm talking a lot. Really quickly, who inspires me by far are students, right? When I see them, then a lot of times students, you know, my job is to teach or talk and provide resources, but students teach me a lot. And in fact, they know some languages that I have never even heard of before in terms of understanding like LGBT stuff. And so I think that's really amazing. But when I hear particularly a student, and from again, my own personal like lens, when I see a black male or male identified student who probably identifies as straight, coming to ask me questions, and they're pushing back against notions of masculinity that can appear harmful, I get so inspired, right? And then they're coming and talking to me, right? I think that is such an amazing thing to see. Also, one of the things that I've been really looking at are conversations about men of color who identify as gay or bi, or men who have sex with men, and reading really, really great poems and also short stories. And one of the books that I picked up this last year, it was a book that was a compilation of stories that was edited by a guy named Keith Boykin. And the book was called For Colored Boys Who've Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Not Enough. But For Colored Boys, if you look that up, it's just a beautiful, beautiful book that really has different narratives from different folks who identify as men and men identified folks. 90% of them are black. And so it's just a great book. And also another book that I was given, I want to say when I first started my job at the GLBTA programs office by Anitra College, who's in the audience somewhere. I'm calling you out. She came in and gave me a book called The New Black Man, by Mark Anthony Neal. And, it came out about in 2005, I think, but it really does provide great models and talks about what is a transformative black, new, maybe even feminist, if you want to call it that, man look like. And this is a beautiful, beautiful book, and one I recommend you all checking out. It's called The New Black Man.
Thank you.
I would say in terms of inspiration, I look to those closest to me and my family. I think that's how I tend to operate. But I look to my partner, my nephews, family that's closest, and see the impact that might have on them, especially those that are younger in my family, trying to see what impacts would, if nothing were to change, what impacts would exist for them, and how might that affect their lives. And that really inspires me to call to action. But then I also I think for myself, some of the challenges and inspiration to kind of cheat and do both at the same time is what I don't know currently. The fact there's so much about myself and my masculinity that I have no idea about, or the impacts that I have on others. It inspires me that I want to learn about that, but it challenges me in the fact that I don't know where that boundary is. There's a lot of things that maybe all of us don't know about me yet. Maybe there's things that you know that I don't. How does that always happen to me? Maybe there are things that you know that I don't about myself yet, and vice versa. And so always that learning process and seeking to understand myself better is what challenges and inspires me at the same time. I have a whole bunch of different things, so bear with me in terms of resources or things to check out. But in terms of if you're interested in books, some that I would recommend, one is called Man Up by Carlos Andres Gomez, a really good kind of life story and the impact that masculinity had through him. Also Guyland by Michael Kimmel is also a good read about kind of giving the idea that there's boys, guys, and men, guys being kind of in that college age traditional sense. And then if you're not into reading kind of on this topic, maybe a TED Talk is more appropriate for you. Tony Porter has a really great TED Talk, as well as Jackson Katz that I would recommend checking out and looking at. And then just to plug, since you're right next to me, Kyle also has a really good YouTube video on 10 responses to the phrase "man up" out there that I would recommend watching as well. Sorry if that, yeah, had to mention it.
I guess I would just have two quick prongs. One of them is, I think, looking at hip-hop and spoken word used in youth spaces. I mean, one, whenever you write and share something and you're a young person, like, one, you're vulnerable, and two, you're thinking critically. So a lot of the most transformative and powerful work I'm seeing is, again, with students, with young people who are just grappling with these issues in that space. And I think some people who have come out of that movement, I'll just throw out a couple of names. Dinez Smith was a student at Central. And now he's a published poet, one of the top spoken word performers in the country, but his work is very much about intersections of blackness and masculinity and a bunch of stuff. It's really, really good. Mark Bamuthi Joseph is a theater, spoken word, dance, mixed media artist who's doing some really incredible work along those same lines. Even right here in town, Tish Jones runs is the executive director of an organization called True Art Speaks, and that's what's running all of the youth poetry slam stuff, which, by the way, tomorrow night is the Youth Slam Finals at Heart of the Beast in Minneapolis. I'm hosting it. It's going to be really, 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 really good. It's at 7 o'clock. So plug there. And then I'm working with a rapper named Heidi Barton Stink, who identifies is a trans woman MC, and she is incredible. And her work coming out soon is going to be really, really powerful. The other prong, just real quick, is like, it gets a bad rap, but Twitter, like someone the other day just asked me for resources on this type of stuff, and I feel terrible. Like, I didn't say, like, here's some books you should read. I said, like, here are some people you should follow on Twitter. And, like, there's some really incredible conversations happening all the time on Twitter if you find the right people, to engage with. So, yeah.
I'll agree. I find a lot of really inspirational stuff on Facebook. I don't know if you guys have heard of it, and I'm assuming maybe some of you have. It's this video called the Awesomeification of You. Has anyone ever heard of that? Because he's also a poet. He's a poet, and you should Google it. It's called the Awesomeification of You. And I don't follow spoken word as much as I probably should, but it's a remarkable kind of a spoken word piece on just really challenging different modes of self-hatred and self-doubt that aren't, and it's by a black male poet, but I think it's really kind of something is for everyone. I think another resource I think is Moya Bailey's work on. She has this essay called Homo Latent Masculinities, which I find really interesting. Also, Mark Anthony Neal, he has a work called another book called Looking for Leroy and Illegible Black Masculinities, and both of them raise the questions about what types of masculinities are legible to us success in the U.S. and why are only certain types of Black masculinities kind of available. The other thing is to think about female masculinities. So thinking about queer, female, female identified hip hop artists. My students are really good about bringing those folks, to me, folks like Steady B and also folks like the Lost Boys. And you're looking at, female masculinity. So we're not really only tying masculinity to male sex subjects, but also to female subjects, and thinking about, some of the fluidity between those kinds of issues, but also thinking about there's another video, and you guys can like Google it because I know it's bad, but I have bad short-term memory, so Google is my crutch. But there's a video called "Be a Man," and being the 3 worst words that can ever be said to of a boy is "be a man," and the violence in that. But these are like really short, to the point clips that really change one's thinking, I think, very quickly, or make you question and deconstruct masculinity in certain ways. So I think those are some of the resources that I would offer. I've been really looking at queer, looking at some of the stuff that's coming out of queer hip hop, I think is important, and spoken word and youth identified spaces, because I think that young people have actually, there's a generation who've come up who have managed to either subvert or transcend some of the more negative ways of performing masculinity, or and that who are male and female, or somewhere in between. So I think that's a good thing to think about as a resource as well too. So just following up.
Thank you all so much. A round of applause for our panelists. Thank you. Oh, okay. So we have about 20 minutes, which is great. We can take a few questions or comments from you guys. We are, hi to everybody who's watching from home. We're webcast today, so Anne is going to be nice enough to walk around with a microphone. We do need you to talk. Even though we might be able to hear you in the room, people at home might not be able to hear. So does anybody have a question or a comment? Yep.
Hi. So you guys talked a little about making it acceptable for men to pursue their passions, even if they're not seen as traditionally masculine. And I feel like in my life I've been in like groups that have been like not part of traditional masculinity, whether it's like playing chess or watching anime. But I find in these communities, since we don't fit in with like traditional athletic masculinity, that's like a lot of men in our communities construct our own masculinity, and because of it, there's a lot of abuse and exclusion directed at women and anyone who doesn't fit in with this masculinity in these communities. So how do we like expand, make us able to like explore our passions without constructing a new masculinity that's just as oppressive?
Excellent. Who wants that one?
So I would say, I'm not now, this is problematic. I'm a female, but I would say start looking for and or creating communities of folks who might think like you and who might be questioning, and thinking more critically about masculinity. I think that's a good way to start. And there are a lot of them, either online, and then there are also, like different types of collectives, but so I'll just leave it there. I would say like, either sometimes you have to create communities here in the Twin Cities, but that's a lot of work, but sometimes that's the necessary kind of labor that needs to be done sometimes.
If I may, I would have to say, since you're already like constructing a new norm of masculinity for the community that you're already building, you're already in a place where you can still continue to build on that with the community that you're creating, right? So why not then start pulling conversations about being more inclusive of other people's bodies, other people's gender expressions into that room already, right? And if there's any pushback, the first thing I would say is that this group doesn't already fit the norm already anyway, right? So why not, be more radical or whatever the word you want to attach to it, to open that space up for more inclusion of all genders, all sexes, all races, etc. Does that make sense? So you're already in a good place already, and I commend you for taking that step and your friends to push against a system and create your own kind of community, and I think that's pretty damn powerful. So.
Yeah, I know there's been a lot of success stories around some of these communities. Like you think about like comic book conventions and how a lot of them now have codes of conduct that have just been introduced in the last couple of years in order to fight back against harassment and the stuff that happens in these spaces. And I think building off what Jason said, like a lot of these communities are ready for this type of stuff. They just have maybe never thought about it before. And I think that's, like we were talking about before, like one of the problems is how unnamed and invisible so much of this stuff is. But again, it's hard to generalize, but what I found is in a lot of these communities, whether it's a geek culture community or, all of this stuff, like, there's a readiness, because a lot of what we're talking about is really like logical and like it makes sense. People just maybe haven't been exposed to the critical thought around it yet.
Thank you. Another question or comment over here? Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm adopted. I was raised by a white family, and I'm read as a black body. And so one of the things that I really struggled with was the moment in which I really engage with my race and try to define that as an individual. And one of the things that was really helpful to me was to just think of myself as a human being, because I don't really understand what the essential differences are between people. So what my question would be then is like, what is the danger of essentializing what your nature is then? Because I recognize the fact that I'm still going to be read as a black body. I'm still going to be read as an African American male. That's going to happen regardless of the way I want to define myself. So how do you essentialize your own nature and at the same time not exclude yourself from the communities that people will read you in? Because I think that that's damaging as well. I think that there are problems in trying to make sure that you are identified as not being part of the, heteronormative, capitalistic patriarchy, however many tropes you want to throw in there. But I think there's a danger in trying to just define yourself against the grain, because it is exclusionary in a sense, but I think it's also necessary. So that's my question.
Any thoughts or reactions?
Well, I think one of the kind of fictions, myths around identity is that they're fixed and stable. So even though you may be read as a black man, and most of the time, there are ways in which identities themselves also are in flux. So they're made, I think identities are also made with, as you move from space to space. And so while you can't, erase how you're going to be read in certain spaces, I think in certain times, certain identities play a more important role. And so there may be times where you need to be more against the grain of what's kind of standard or conventional within one particular type of space, but then there may be other spaces where you might want to be in solidarity with for other types of purposes. And I think for folks who have to move in between different types of, whether it's, your family, whether it's different types of community spaces, etc., I think there are ways in which identity itself is often, whether we know it or not or acknowledge it or not, it's mobilized in a particular way for particular purposes. And so I think that conundrum that you find yourself in, I think that's something, I don't know that you have to actually resolve that particular issue, but just know that while certain things may, like this process of being blackened in white spaces, whether you want to or not, those things might remain kind of static to a certain extent, but in other places, your maleness or your performance of gender, etc., may actually be playing a different role, etc. So I'm just one who believes that identities are, they're slippery. Sometimes they stick, but other times they slide. But with that said, power is real and dominance is real. And so we just have to be conscious and cognizant of the times when, you know, our reading and the way our bodies are being read and our politics are being read, you know, whether it's against the grain or whether it's kind of conformist. I think we have a little bit of if not control, but I think at least influence over that. So I don't know that it has to be resolved, and I think that. So I would say, you know, I think being okay with these certain types of ambiguities might be helpful, you know, empowering. And in other times, you like, to hell with that. I'm a black man, you know, and this is what it's going to be. And so I think that I think it's in flux, basically, is what I'm trying to say. But thank you for that question. It's a really kind of an important and complex question. It's important for us to think about.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Any other responses, or should we move on to a new question? Okay, another question from you guys? Thank you.
Howdy. So I was in Virginia a couple weeks ago with the university's debate team, rural Virginia, and on occasion of 3 or 4 times was addressed as sir or you know, bro, I think, hey man, what's up, dude, a couple times, stuff like that. And it was actually quite alarming for me, kind of speaking to what you were speaking to about the hypermasculine black male identity being dangerous. And I was really uncertain sort of how to navigate the space being maybe perceived as more dangerous than would be perceived here in Minnesota, or maybe not here in Minnesota. And so my sort of question is, we have gotten really close to this discussion about what like masculinity means for people who identify as female, but sort of how does that conversation like help us to think about how to navigate through situations that are very similar to what was going on in Virginia? So.
Thank you. Anyone?
So I think, you know, I mean, I'm feminine. I was looking at my clothes. I'm like, you dress like an old white woman. Well, that's because you get your clothes at thrift stores and see, like, damn. So that's my presentation. I'm just going to say that. So, what I would say, you know, I think is dangerous, because I didn't really start thinking critically about female masculinities until I was looking at the community mobilizations behind the death of this young, she was female, but you might think of her as trans now, a young teenager named Sakia Gunn, who was walking with her girlfriends and she ended up being killed. And I'm like, well, you know, when people perform, you know, different types of masculinity, particularly black masculinity, I do feel like people view them as a threat. And so I don't know how to get at that question, because I don't know how we could change like these ingrained patterns of anti-black, particularly black male racism that kind of circulate in society today. And I know I did an experiment with my children, my students, where I dressed out in a particular way, which I never do. And they were like, but I'm like, I don't feel safe, because not too long ago, you know, a young, they had the picture of us black male up who supposedly, you know, took some girl's backpack, and the student was, you know, attacked with that. And so I think it's risky and it's bold, but I don't know what the answers to that is because of the way in which people read black masculinity. So, but these are just my kind of thoughts, but I don't know how to get at that question, because it has a lot to do with other people and their perceptions rather than who we are and what we think we are representing, you know, so I don't know how to get at that. So.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We maybe have time for one more question or comment, if there's nothing else anybody wants to say up here about that. No? One more?
Okay, I have something. I'd like to ask Guante. I don't mean to put you on the spot, Guante, but I think that the discussion has been really excellent, but I also think that sometimes the arts, like hip-hop and music and poetry, really sort of hits the nail on the head sometimes. And so I was wondering if you would just do one won something. I don't care if it's what you're going to do tomorrow night, and that was a good plug, but whatever you think, would you be willing to do that? Thanks.
If there are no other questions, I can take the last 3 minutes we have. Here's the thing, because it's being filmed at home, I changed my mind to what I said earlier. I'd really like to do this without a mic just because I can use my whole body. And so if you're watching at home, this is online. So the poem I'm going to do, can I stand here? Oh, I don't want to stand. I don't want to stand in front of you. I'll stand right here. This is good. So yeah, the piece that was mentioned earlier is called 10 Responses to the Phrase Man Up, but that's really easy to find online. I'm going to do this other piece, which kind of talks about some of the same things, but through a different framework. I never really thought of a title for it, so online it's just called Handshakes. The weirdest thing about having your hand crushed is that the pair of eyes across from yours never stops smiling. As knuckles are compressed, as the skin is all but torn off the top of your hand, he always has this stupid grin on his face. Even as the vein bulges from his neck, he smiles until you grudgingly mumble, "That's quite a handshake." And he releases you. See, as a young man, I was taught that one's masculinity is tied directly to one's handshake. That when meeting another man for the first time, no sin was more unforgivable than placing a limp fish in his hand, the dead husk of a greeting. Your grip must be firm, like the way you hold your briefcase when you walk to work, or the way you hold the handle while standing up on the bus. Some men, however, prefer a grip like a battle axe mid-swing, like ripping the head off an antelope by tugging on the antlers. Some men treat every handshake as a gladiator's death match, a test of strength, a test of will. And when I meet these men, as I often do, their tectonic plate handshakes never fail to illuminate my myriad inadequacies. Frozen there with purple fingertips, I'm reminded that I cannot stand the taste of beer, that cars confuse and frighten me, that when faced with a barbecue and a pair of tongs, I will overcook the meat every time. These men attempt to squeeze the testosterone from my body. Maybe I'm just insecure, but studying his smirk more closely, I think maybe that would make two of us, because as he wrings the color from my fingertips, I find myself wanting to ask him, do you ever feel trapped? In the mornings when you're, I don't know, watching SportsCenter and downing that protein shake made from raw eggs, liquefied steak, and Axe body spray. Do you ever crush the glass between your fingers by accident? Do you ever get tired of the voice in the back of your head? You're the one that sounds just like Dennis Leary, telling you to constantly reaffirm that you're a real man by catcalling women, eating enormous hamburgers, and squeezing things really, really hard. I find myself wanting to ask him, do you hold your wife's arm like this when you're angry? Is there a teddy bear somewhere in your history being ripped away from a pair of hands that just aren't strong enough? Do you remember the first time your father wouldn't let you hold his hand when you crossed the street? Do you remember the way he looked at you? Do you remember being handed your firstborn son and not knowing how to hold him? Do you remember squeezing his shoulders like this the first time he disappointed you? Do you remember what it was you were trying to hold on to? I know that there is so much space between us as men that sometimes we feel compelled to cram as much contact as we physically can into every touch. I know we become so comfortable with crushing, so hypnotized by our own strength, we forget how incredible it can feel to let go.
On that note, I think we'll end our discussion today. Thank you all for coming. A round of applause again for everybody in the panel. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone.